I'm excited to welcome you all to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Brent Ameneyro with us tonight to celebrate his new collection, A Face Out of Clay. Brent, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Before we really dive into the questions, could you start us off with a brief reading of some poems?
Yeah, I think I'm going to borrow a format that I used in a virtual reading earlier this year, where I read one poem from the book, and then I'm going to share a digital poem that is also in the collection, but was originally published as a digital poem. And so I want to be able to kind of showcase that since we have this virtual venue, I might as well take advantage of it. I'm just going to read one poem here, and then I'll go into that digital poem. This poem is called Frantic Ghosts. We drove into the velvet desert sky, asleep with our eyes open. The shadowed sagebrush appeared in our headlights like fleeting childhood memories. The glowing road lifted past the headlights into our eyes as each rectangular white line was a page turning in our minds. Clouds curled over the mountains as a young girl warned us of floods on the Texas highway. The little crosses with flowers on the side of the road stopped popping up, replaced by machines methodically drawing the black blood of the earth out. Pockets of fog and rain introduced the dark. A purple cloud flashed above an eternal flame. Everywhere we looked was a new display of paranormal light. The longer we drove under the starless sky, as hundreds of miles of not yet tumbling tumbleweeds turned into city lights, the more we forgot about the mundane daylight, the monotonous routines of everyone in the disappearing cities. One day, this will all return to desert, and all the frantic ghosts vibrating in the oleander, turning branches into bones and leaves into flesh, might finally find peace. The digital poem I'm going to share moves rather quickly, so don't feel bad if you miss something. Just get what you can and kind of, be present for the experience, I guess is probably the best way to say it.
Dio che ci ha illuminato con la predicazione di Santo, insegni con l'esempio della
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing the poems from the book. And I love the way we got to interact with that digital poem too. So I'm sure I'll have a couple questions about that as well. But it was really kind of a visceral experience to kind of engage with all of the visual nature of it, but also the sonic nature of what's going in the background. So lots to talk about. Thank you. Thank you for all of that. All right. Before we get into questions, and our first question is always really difficult, so we'll start out kind of easy. Could you just tell us a little bit about who you are and maybe how you came to poetry?
Yeah, I am the son of a Mexican immigrant father, and my mom is from Wisconsin. And so I have both the kind of like split identity in the sense of having two different cultures and two different types of families. The way that they cook, the way that they raise their kids, everything's a little different. But then also I lived for 2 years in Mexico as a child, and so I also kind of have the experience of living in two different countries. And so not just the lived experience of being kind of split with the family in our house, but also the literal split between two countries. And I think that I'm starting with that because I feel like that's a big part of my identity and of who I am, and also the impetus for writing this collection. So that's I guess big picture. That's who I am. But I've been writing poetry and making music, most of my life, for over 20 years, and so it's just something that I've always felt. Like I wanted to nurture, and it's just always been a part of my life. And I studied poetry during my undergrad around 2008, and then again in grad school in 2019. So that's a little bit of my personal and a little bit of the like kind of formal education, I guess. But if you have any other specific questions, I can kind of dive into anything too.
No, that's great. I think that gives us a good foundation too to think about the way that some of those like dualities come into the collection as well too. And even with the poem that we just sort of experienced, right? The way that we're moving sort of away from the natural world. So that tension as well. All right, we'll get to our first and maybe toughest question here. But I always like to kind of start with this one because as poets, we're always noticing things. We're sort of obsessing over our own work in different ways, and we're doing things on the level of craft that maybe is subconscious on some level, but is something that was really interesting. So what's something that you notice that you do within your work that maybe hasn't been brought up to you before, or something you haven't been asked about yet, that you've been wanting to kind of talk about?
Well, people tend to focus on what's there, and I think it's easy to talk about the concrete imagery because I do use that a lot in my work. And of course it's talking about identity and Mexico and the United States, and these kind of like more tangible discussion points tend to be what come up. But there's this other kind of like, I don't know, subterranean thing that kind of permeates the work, and it's more meditative. It's a less tangible. It's a little more ethereal. So I think it's easy to kind of talk about countries and language and that sort of thing, but it's probably not as easy to just even ask the question about like breathing and transcendence and meditation and things like that. So I don't blame anyone for not bringing that up because I don't even know what that question would be, but that tends to be like the one thing I think that is not brought up as much.
Yeah, It's funny that you say that because I mentioned earlier that I sent you questions, but then I sort of came up with a bunch of other things that I was hoping we could talk about. And I made a note about um, the use of sort of breath and space and kind of music in that way in terms of the poetry. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those kind of like tactile elements or kind of embodied elements of the work that you see coming through. And that's, yeah, it's kind of a vague question, but it was something I was noticing when I was going back through the poems, is there's this recentering on so many kind of tactile experiences. And I think breath is one of those that sort of recurs throughout the collection.
Yeah, I I intentionally wanted breath to be in there, and that kind of visceral, you know, physical experience, and autonomic experience that we all have, that I wanted to include that in there, because that's how I recenter myself, and how I'm able to kind of gain clarity. If a poem, or any kind of art project is just um, not aligning, something's not connecting, I give it space. And I go out in nature, I breathe. I think like it's really important to just have fresh air, and I think writing and I don't know, it's always like you're hunched over on a desk, inside somewhere, and the air is very stale. So so yeah, I think fresh air and breathing. I like to read outside as much as possible. I always like to give the image of just like laying under a tree reading a book, is like the best luxury in the world. And so that's, to me, that's like part of my practice. And so I wanted that to be in here, like literally in there, because that's how I'm breathing life into the work, is through this literal process, going outside and clearing myself. So I don't know if I'm answering
Yeah.
your question.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I love the way that we're seeing all of that sort of come into these poems, right? There's this sort of emphasis on the natural world and like the presence of nature and that sort of imagery, which we might talk about later too. So yeah, no, that's wonderful, and that was one that I did not give you time to prepare for, so. Let's talk a little bit just about the general structure of the book, because I think that's always something that when I'm kind of making my way through a new collection, I'm always like, oh, okay, how is the structure really working here? And we have that opening poem that I've seen, some people call it a prologue poem or a proem or something like that. And then we have those untitled parts, those 5 sections of the book. So could you just talk a little bit about how you found this structure for the book? Was it always structured like this, or did you try different shapes or organizing principles to sort of get these poems in order?
Yeah, I love like talking about this, the sequencing and arranging, rearranging, thinking about narrative, and I don't, it doesn't always come up, but the concept of narrative arc in a poetry collection, I think because it's not as clear, it's not as linear, but it's there. And or at least I try to make it there in my collection. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about my journey of formulating the sequencing and the arrangement as you see it now in a book. It originally started, formulating this. The first poems were really on those 2 years that my family spent living in Mexico. It was really just, I wanted to just sit with that and remember it, and have as much of that in the collection as possible. And so that was really the beginning. I thought I was going to write this whole collection was just going to be a meditation on childhood and those years that I spent living in Mexico. And so that was kind of like my initial, all right, this is where I'm going to go. But that really, was really just the starting point. Thinking about the narrative progression in relation to the age of the speaker, because then, it wasn't just about those years in childhood, then it became moments in adulthood and moments in the US and moments in Mexico, and then those coming together, and then thinking also about, arranging them in terms of geographic placement. So I thought about, is this going to be like, you're starting with the child and then, going in that kind of, and that didn't work. I think even just thinking that, and thinking about the poems in that arrangement, I knew it wasn't going to work. And talking it out with other poets, I just knew that wasn't going to be the final arrangement. But I think the brain naturally, or at least mine does, goes there, right? Like you think chronologically, so it's like, all right, let's go from the beginning. But eventually, like all those traditional kind of narrative pillars started to kind of dissolve, and the poem started to find their permanent placement in what I feel is kind of a natural ebb and flow of order and chaos, narrative and lyric, and just kind of this back and forth between several things. And so I'm always thinking about music and the relationship of music to poetry. And in music, you can learn to play an instrument. You can get as technical as you want, and you can think about it kind of mechanically or even mathematically. But when you improvise on an instrument, and you let go, you perform with other musicians, it's less about structure and knowledge, and it's more about feeling and flow. And so I think if I can kind of summarize how I put the collection together, it was kind of keeping that at the heart of it. It was just focusing more on the feeling and the flow of it rather than thinking about it mechanically.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you're sort of drawing these connections to music too, because there's so many ways that music is kind of referenced or under the surface here. But we also get so much musicality within the poems themselves as well. So I think, yeah, I love that idea, that kind of ebb and flow. And I do find that it is easy to kind of default to, chronological, right? And then it's sort of like, okay, wait, that's not actually working. That's not what these poems need. How can we kind of complicate that, as you said, right? Bring in order and disorder and sort of play around with that too. I love that. And I see lots of great questions in the chat. So I'm not ignoring you all, I promise. I did want to talk a little bit about the opening poem, Making a Face Out of Granite, and how you see that kind of situating the reader into the collection, and maybe how you see that poem working with or maybe working against the title of the collection and the title poem of the collection, A Face Out of Clay, because they're kind of two tactically very different materials in those titles, and I was really interested in that distinction there.
Yeah, I really love the idea of something so short being able to say so much. I think on the scale of like minimalist to maximalist, I'm probably closer to minimalist. I think it's like the ultimate challenge is like, how can you say as much as possible with as little as possible? And that's not necessarily the goal, and nor should it be the goal for all poets. But at times, I just think like it's just such a exciting thing to be able to make some. It's almost harder to make something really small that does a lot. So that first poem, I feel like it does a lot of work. And so, I wanted this, it's haiku to set the tone for the collection. Like I wanted my readers to think, there's a lot happening here with not a lot, which means I'm going to have to do a lot of work. right? And so that was kind of the goal of putting that in the beginning, was to set the expectation with the reader that there's some labor on your part that's going to be expected here in this dance. I knew I wanted To My Ancestors, the Shakespearean sonnet that comes after the haiku, to really open the collection, but Making a Face Out of Granite just felt like that it was really going to nail that invitation to the reader. Um, so yeah, and I think also, like, just the title of the collection, you don't expect the first poem to be Making a Face Out of Granite when the title is A Face Out of Clay.
Right.
And so I think working against expectations in that way too is kind of something that I wanted to do right from the beginning, is just to kind of immediately flop you, in the opposite direction that you might expect. A little disorienting maybe. But at the same time, both clay and granite are of the earth. And so there's that clear connection there. But granite being a harder material, obviously, than clay, I think it also tells the reader, immediately going from the title to that first poem, that, one thing, the earth, can produce two very different things. And I think it's like in the same way that a person can be both joyous and sad, or the way that a country can hold both corruption and beauty. And so I wanted to have that right in the beginning, to go from something soft like clay to something so hard like granite being like the hardest stone. And in sculpting, granite is the hardest. So you always have to have like harder tips to chisel with. And so going from clay, which you can work with your hands, to going to granite, which you need these hard tools, that felt like a kind of it's like a juxtaposition, but within the same house, right? Because they're both from the earth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I thank you so much for kind of deepening the connections there, because I love what you're saying about signaling to the reader that they'll have to do some work. I think, we should expect our readers to do some work for our poems, right? And the material of granite, right, to make a face out of granite is that work as well, right? It's not an easy process. So yeah, I think that's a really kind of great kind of duality to that, like all those layers there that are sort of positioning us into the collection. And then we dive into the kind of true opening poem, which is that sonnet. I did want to talk about form, and I think maybe this is a good place to talk about form, and then we can talk about the digital poem as a form as well. Since you brought that in, but we've already mentioned sonnets in a couple different ways. There's a really cool pantoum with super long lines. There's so many kind of different variations of form here, and you've also invented your own form of the tectonic. So I just wondered generally if you could talk about your relationship to form, and then I know you wanted to kind of deep dive a little bit into your invented form for us, which would be great.
yeah, so I'll kind of touch back on what I mentioned in the beginning. So I'll start with like my formal education. I studied form pretty in a very structured environment with Joshua McKinney in 2008 at CSU Sacramento. And then I studied again with Blas Falconer at San Diego State when I went back to grad school. And that was my formal education on form. So, as my dad always says, punto y aparte, it's like, there's that. All right, now let's talk about the next paragraph. I think in application, form is a lot more fluid than it might seem in a classroom. I think it's something that when you learn it, it becomes, it becomes a part of you. It's less cognitive. And so sometimes I'm writing a poem and it just becomes a sonnet on its own. and then when I'm revising and looking at it later, I'm nitpicking to make it more into that form, or maybe it was close enough to a sonnet that I'm like, oh, it's asking to be a sonnet. I need to adjust this here or there. Other times I'm writing the poem, it's not really working, and then I use form as a way to kind of push it through this, like, I guess that you could say, like pushing, if you could imagine, like you push clay through like a star shape and then it comes out as a star on the other side. So sometimes I use it in that way, like the poem's just, it needs something, and so then I'm like, all right, let me force it into this shape and see if it is satisfied in that way. I think, like, I want to go back to that music analogy again that I was talking about earlier. You learn form, but then you let it live in your body, not really in your brain. And so to me, writing a poem in form feels more like that jam session with friends rather than completing a school assignment. So I'll give an example. So when I when learning the drums, which is like my primary instrument, the instrument that I love the most, you learn rudiments like the paradiddle, which is right, left, right, right, left, right, left, left. And so as you're learning your rudiments, you're kind of practicing these things to build your coordination. But when making music, it's not like mid-song, I'm thinking, oh, I'm gonna throw a paradiddle in here. It's maybe halfway through a drum fill or something, a paradiddle, something like a paradiddle happens, maybe not even exactly, but it's almost unconsciously, and it's not necessarily textbook execution. And so that's kind of the way that I use form when writing poetry, is I want it to happen naturally. I don't want it to feel contrived and forced. And I guess another way to say it is, I want someone who doesn't read poetry to read it and they don't care whether it's a form or not. Like the sonnet that To My Ancestors, the opening sonnet, it has the rhyme scheme, but it's slant rhyme, and it's all done, it's all very quiet. And so, someone who doesn't know the form is going to read this and not feel like it's sing-songy, traditional form, kind of that old school, rigid rhythm. It's going to feel a little bit more fluid, almost like the form's not there. And that, I think I'm more interested in that use of form, where it's there, but you don't know it unless you're paying attention to it, right? Like if you're like studying the poem, you're like, oh, I can see this rhyme scheme, I can see this thing happening, and da 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 da. But I don't want that to be so loud and dominant that it's taking away from the content of the poem. Yeah, I guess moving on to the tectonic poems. So I invented this form. There was an assignment in one of my MFA classes with Blas Falconer, his form and theory class. And after studying a bunch of forms, he said, why don't, you could either go ahead and write one of these other forms that we've studied, or you can create your own form and then teach it to the class. And so, I was in this space where I felt like I wanted to, I don't know, like complicate my natural rhythm. I wanted to disrupt the syntax that I kind of kept returning to. Just kind of break out of that, sometimes you just get in like where you feel like you're doing the same thing over and over, and you're like, I want to, completely just explode it and turn it on its head. And I was thinking a lot about prose poetry and erasure at the time, and I had experimented with both prose poems and erasure poems, and hadn't really been satisfied with the results. But there were a lot of prose poems that I admired, that I was excited about, and I liked erasure poems, but usually the erasure poems that I liked were using other people's texts. And so then I thought, what if I take it almost like erasure, not quite, but I'm going to do that to myself. So the tectonic poem is literally taking a prose poem, copy paste it, and then whatever you take out of the first paragraph appears in the second, and vice versa. And so if we have time, I don't know,
Yeah, let's do it.
rambling too much? Okay. Let me share. All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is not my poem, but I wanted to show you how to do it. Let's say this was your poem, as an example. And you were, this is a beautiful poem on its own, so you wouldn't probably want to do it with a poem that is already working so well as a prose poem, because you're like, this is already beautiful and magical, why change it, right? It's not asking to be anything else. So in this case, I would probably say, don't do that with this poem, because it's already a beautiful poem as it is. But I'm going to just show you the technical aspect of what you would do. So I just highlighted the text and copied it, then I pasted it below. So it's the same thing twice, but I'm going to go in the beginning, for example, and say the day is tulips and air. And so I'm just changing the text to white, because what that does is it preserves the exact spacing of where the text was. And I want that, because I want this bottom one to be mirrored. So now I'm going to go down here and say, all right, well, if that's what I want my first line to be, the day is tulips and air, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to take out everything that stayed there. So the day is tulips and air. It's going to come out. So as you work your way down, you get to the bottom, and then the whole thing you're going to find, let's say, we're just going to play around here a little bit and fun, kind of improvise. Sunshine. Window. Through the water. In the bathtub, we'll keep that in there, why not? Right. And then I'm going to come down to the line here again. So sunshine's up there, so I got to take it out down here. Window. So I'm going to take that out. And then through the water in the bathtub. So I'm going to take that out down here. Now, the challenge is you work your way through, and your first paragraph, you're like, you created exactly what you wanted. It flows the way you want it to. It's kind of magical and all this. And then you go and read the second half, and maybe it's a little chaotic and it's not exactly what you want. Then you can go back and be like, well, actually, maybe I want fresh washed up here. So I'm actually going to take that out here. Right? And then I'm going to just bring it back up here. The day is fresh washed tulips in air. That works. I like that. And then down here, I took out fresh wash. So now it starts with and fair. Of course, I'm not going to know how this is going to work out until I work my way all the way through and see where I leave off here, and then let it continue there. So it's a little bit of a way of, again, disrupting your own writing process, and of it's specifically disrupting your syntax, and hopefully getting you a little uncomfortable. You know, and thinking of the form named tectonics as you know, the things that happen with tectonic plates, volcanoes, earthquakes, tend to be pretty uncomfortable. The ground's shaking, there's all these, surreal things happening. And so keeping in mind that that's at the heart of the form, I think is you have to let go a little bit.
Mhm. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that deep dive. I mean, I think we can talk so much about form, and it's really something else to see the process behind it. I mean, even just, oh, turning the text white versus erasing the text, right? So those kind of tactile things, really engaging with almost like a sensory detail as well, a sensory level. That's super, super interesting. And I loved kind of engaging with the poems, because you start to see that there's something pulling them together, but you're not entirely sure how those threads are kind of making their way through until you're like, oh, okay, this is how the form is kind of interlocking. So really, really cool.
Yeah, lots of opportunity for surprise.
Mm-hmm. And that's the best part of writing poetry, at least in my opinion, is those surprises. And I like what you were saying too about disrupting your own syntax and your own process, the ways that we can sort of fall back on our kind of comfort zones, even without knowing it. And then I've, gone back to drafts. I'm like, oh, I feel like all my poems are like sounding the same, not just because they're coming from me, but like even the rhythms are the same. So I love that. A
Yes.
kind of urgency to disrupt that and to lean into that disruption too. Thank you. I know we had a couple questions in the chat just generally about the digital poem, thinking about it as potential performance art and maybe how you conceptualize that poem. Did you think that it would be digital in that form first before the printed page? How did you incorporate the music? Just anything you want to share about that form in itself.
Yeah, so that one I had it mostly written in traditional printed form before I made it into a GIF. And I think when I was making it into a GIF, it that kind of influenced a little bit of change on the page, and so it was a little bit of a back and forth. The version that I showed you with the music, and they had like a little introduction to the poem too, that is more just like a version that I made for instances like this where I'm sharing it. The actual published version, there is no music because it is a GIF. It loops. And so it doesn't, it's not a video, so it doesn't allow you to pause it. And it just continually loops and runs nonstop. And so that's a form that I'm interested in because it, it takes away a little bit of the power from the reader, forces them to read at a pace and in a way that that I then have control of. And so that's kind of a fun thing to play with too, because I feel like, on the page, you could take as long as you want with it, and you can write on it and you can engage with it in this way. And so the GIF, I think challenges the reader in a new way, that I think it's fun and exciting. And I like both. I think some people make digital art and electronic literature, and that becomes a primary form for them. And for me, I see it like any other form, like a sonnet or like a pantoum, where if it makes sense for the poem to be in that form, then I'll play with that. But if not, then it's not my primary thing. I'm still very much in love with the traditional printed text. So.
Great. Yeah, I think it's always really interesting to see how we can use these sort of digital forms and kind of engage with a poem in a different way. And yeah, I, love the tactile nature. I've sort of written all over the inside of these books. But there is something really interesting in that relationship between the view, like the reader and the screen, or the reader and that moving image too. And thinking about breath, especially with that poem, and almost a breathlessness that happens with the kind of recurrence of the imagery as well. Yeah, thank you. Let me see. Let me just make sure I'm not like missing some big questions in the chat here. We've talked about music quite a bit. Oh, here's a kind of a general kind of publishing question, just about sort of accumulating poems for a collection from Luke. So if you foresee that a group of poems you've been writing could kind of fall into a collection, do you submit them individually and then do the manuscript separately? I guess just thinking about your process in particular, do you send them out to literary journals? Do you sort of wait until you have kind of an accumulation of a potential collection before you do that?
Yeah, well, I'm working on my second manuscript now, and so I think I can, speak to that now from the perspective of doing both. But I feel like the poems need time to mature, and generally find their home in conversation with other poems. And so usually the majority of the manuscript is at least the bones are there. The skeleton of that manuscript is there before I start submitting individual poems to journals. Because it takes that amount of time for the poems to fully mature. For the first collection, I wanted to have a chapbook out before my full length, and so my process was submit individual poems, and then submit chapbook, and then submit full length. The chapbook had a lot of almosts. It was a lot of finalists for this, long listed for that, honorable mention, et cetera, et cetera. And so I didn't want to wait for it. And so by the time I had gone through that process, because the submission and waiting and all that, it's a long process. It can take years. And so by the time, after going through all of that with the chapbook, I had already felt like I had the full length manuscript. So then there was a little overlap. I had already started submitting the full length while I was still submitting, or at least waiting to hear back from chapbook submissions. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think in terms of the way poems might speak to each other, that's really interesting, and something that I think about when I've sort of accumulated some kind of mass of some poems. It's like, okay, are these talking to each other in some way? Is there something that's maybe holding these together? And I often use that as sort of the kind of kickstart, then like, okay, maybe I'll kind of toss some out, submit some, see what's going on.
Yeah, I think it also is like acts as like a barometer of because sometimes you write a poem, and if it's not in conversation with other poems, you're not sure if it even makes sense. Like, is this even anything? Is this even a poem, or is it just an utterance? And so it's nice to have a more developed manuscript to be able to gauge poems next to other poems. All of a sudden, you have 50 pages of poems, and within those 50 pages, there's one that just stands out. You're just like, this is a dang good poem. Then you're going to hold all the other ones to that same level.
Mm.
Be like, well, if these other ones aren't at that same level, then maybe I don't have 50 pages, maybe I only have 30. And because if they're not even close to that same caliber, maybe I don't want them to be published.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking too about how this speaks a little bit to the revision process as well. So I wondered if you could talk about your approach to revision. You've mentioned time and sort of letting the poem sit and mature, which I think is so important. And it ebbs and flows in different ways for different poems. But yeah, what's your revision process like? Is it structured? Do you just sort of take it poem by poem?
I I understand the separation between the terms writing and revision, but I think in my mind I don't really separate the two. I think it's all part of writing. And I think that it's more in my mind anyway, not saying that this is like a objective concept, but um in my mind it's more like the difference of the initial utterance and then the uh the simmering. It's
Mm.
like a stew. It's sitting on low heat and it's all cooking together. And I think if you call all of that cooking, you're not really going to differentiate between chopping the vegetables beforehand and an hour later tasting the soup and adding some spices to get it to where you want it to be. That's all cooking, right? And so I think in writing, that's kind of how I see it, is it's all writing. But I think that some poems just need more time than others. Some poems do come out in that initial utterance a little bit more complete than others. Sometimes a poem just needs to be so, assisted and helped along that it's mostly in what we would call revision. And then almost the writing doesn't even exist because most of it was created in the so-called revision. So yeah, I think overall I try to think of it as I'm spending time with this work, and I try not to think of it cognitively too much. I always try my best to just return to the body, listen to my gut, listen to my heart. Those things I think are more relevant in the writing process than the brain. And so, I think rather than seeing it as this, amount of time spent on a poem or the difference of writing a revision, so again, a lot more fluid and a lot more kind of listening to that gut response, because a poem will tell you when there's a word that isn't working or a line that's not working, and if you calibrate that gut and that response from the body, and you learn to listen to that, I think that's probably the most important stage of writing. The utterance is beautiful and magical. I think, sometimes it feels like something comes from nothing, and it feels like, you're like, pulling divine energy from the cosmos to, come onto the page. And so that's always, of course, the exciting part. But I think that all of the phases of writing are equally important and ultimately contribute to the final form of the poem.
Yeah, I appreciate that kind of configuration as well, because when we sort of collapse revision and writing together, you can really see the importance of all of those elements working together versus that separation where there's might be some resistance to revision, resistance to maybe losing that magic of that initial utterance. But when we're kind of seeing it, I love the cooking metaphor, right? We're just sort of developing the stew of the poem,
Right.
or even the collection.
Yeah.
Let me just take a quick look at time. Okay, we've got some time and plenty of questions. I really wanted to talk about the way that you bring in other voices, but also this kind of storytelling motif that recurs throughout the collection. And of course, we talked a little bit about that kind of opening poem, To My Ancestors, which sort of sets the stage. But there's some different mentions about storytelling or stories that have been told. So I just wondered if you could kind of talk about how you navigated that kind of through line between the poems, and how you see the role of maybe the speaker's community or family, and these stories that are kind of passed down, impacting the maybe journey through the collection.
Yeah, I want to return to that image that I gave earlier of laying under a tree reading a book, and how I consider that to be a luxury and not something that I take for granted. And maybe just kind of holding on to that as I try to work my way through answering this question. My father's father died younger than I am now. And so my father's mother, my grandmother, raised, all the kids alone. And she worked so hard her whole life that she didn't even have fingerprints by the end of her life. And so, when someone says that they work their fingers to the bone, is usually hyperbole. But there's like literally just generations of hard work before me. My father worked hard in restaurants and other jobs to support the family. My mother worked long hours in her career. So when I speak of family and ancestors, I'm thinking of sacrifices that were made for me to lay under that tree to read a poetry book, right? For me to even have the peace, the inner peace. It's not even about any kind of practical thing, but just to not be in a chaotic environment, that it took generations for me to be able to have that peace to lay under a tree and read a poetry book. So I kind of see it as like a duty for me to nurture my artistic intuition, in order to honor those sacrifices. So I don't take the leisure for granted. I don't take that luxury for granted. And that the idea of being a poet is probably never crossed the minds of any of my ancestors. Like, just not even close. And so when I wrote this collection, I wanted it to be with their voices too. So the speaker's community is just as important as the speaker. And so I think there's probably three primary voices in the collection. It's the speaker's conscious mind, the speaker's subconscious mind, and the speaker's community. And then I braided these voices throughout the collection. So at times the reader can come across something that seems like a simple observation, but it's embedded, or I guess, composed with these voices. And then that makes that simple thing multidimensional.
Yeah.
I don't know if did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really beautiful answer, and kind of speaks to the ways the collection is doing that kind of reaching out, and the importance of community and support. And then, yeah, it even made me think about the ways that even like the physical landscape became kind of part of that community in different ways throughout the poems too. So yeah, thank you for answering that. Maybe we'll kind of wrap up with our final question of the night, which is the saddest part of our evening. But we always like to get a kind of go-to piece of craft advice. So what advice would you give to a poet who's maybe feeling stuck approaching the page?
Well, I think, like I said earlier, it's important to learn and to study and to have the knowledge and all of that. That's all important. But again, punto y aparte. So that's good. Let's put that in one box and then let's move on from that. And then once you have that and you make the next step, there really are no rules. And really it's just preferences and guidelines. Some people don't like adverbs, some people don't like similes, some prefer clarity, some prefer abstraction. And so I'll go back to saying, listen to your gut and your heart before you listen to your brain. A poem should feel good. And if something feels off, it's the poem asking you to change that thing. So listen to that feeling. That's your gut or your heart trying to tell you something about the poem. And I think sometimes in academia and the literary sphere, it can get kind of cognitive. It can get very heady. And I think it's important to remember that poetry is this 5,000-year-old tradition, and that you're joining this conversation as a complex emotional being. And so that that to me, just even saying that out loud, that is more body than brain, right? Like so again, it's important, learn the things, get the knowledge, get that experience, and then that's one box. And then when you move out and you're out into the world of being an artist, then recognizing that it's really just calibrating the body and listening to it and finding that guide, and it's less thinking and more feeling.
Wow, thank you for that advice and sort of reminder, right, of what we're all doing by writing and joining this conversation. Though our conversation might end tonight, it's still that kind of ongoing beautiful project of poetry. And I love, again, that we're kind of recentering the body in this experience as well. So as we wrap up, Brent, thank you so much for just everything that you shared, for your poems. Everyone, please make sure you buy a copy of A Face Out of Clay. I know that you'll enjoy spending time with these poems as much as I did over the past couple weeks. The link is in the chat to pick up a copy. So thank you for being here this evening. And Brent, thank you again for joining us. It's been such an illuminating chat.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Zach, and the Writer Center, and thank you everyone for being here.